There would be headlines in the papers. Even the grown-up gangs who ran the betting at the all-in wrestling and the Barrow Boys would hear with respect of how old Misery's house had been destroyed. It was as though this plan had been with him all his life, pondered through the seasons, now in his 15th year crystallized with the pain of puberty. And you never get back to that intensity. Puberty is everyone's first experience of a sentient madness. What is Richard Kelly trying to communicate with Donnie Darko? Where do you go at night? What happened to my son? Hello, movie lovers. Welcome home. My name is Amy Hensarling, and you're listening to Watch This List. This is a very special episode of Amy's Progress because it is my 1-year sobriety anniversary. And I went through a couple of iterations of what movie I wanted to use for this. The first thing I wanted to do was Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring, because I thought that the ring represented addiction. And I was all prepared to do that with that angle. And I rewatched the movie last week. And I didn't feel like it was addiction at all. Because the ring is just trying to get back to its master. And somehow the metaphor just fell apart the more that I thought about it. Just because people are tempted by it and find it difficult to put down. It's a little too elusive because it's really about the addiction to power more than anything. But I did get a valuable lesson from Fellowship that I think is perhaps useful for sobriety speak, which is something that Gandalf says at the beginning when Frodo's like, here, you take it, you hold it, I don't want it. And he says he would want to use it for good, but he doesn't trust himself. That idea of evil being used for good is an intriguing one, and it never works out. Evil cannot be used for good. It's just going in one direction, trying to get home. And the other part of that is that it can only be destroyed in the fire. It can't be broken. Can't be redeemed. Mount Doom. Which fits nicely with Donnie Darko. Because Richard Kelly had a doomsday preoccupation. He said in an interview I watched in 2017 that he was obsessed with the apocalypse. And it fascinated him. And the timing of this is very, very interesting. I want to talk about time travel, which is basically what I'm doing right now. I'm speaking to you now, and I'm thinking about the past, where I was last year, how much work it took to get here. When Kelly wrote Darko in 1998, which he said when the interviewer asked him how long it took him to write the script, guess what he said? 28 days, 6 hours, 42 minutes, and 12 seconds. No joke. He started it on October 2nd, 1998, and said he finished it right before Halloween. And he set the film in 1988 because it was a time of intense transition when Dukakis was running against Bush, and a lot of things were changing. And then it ended up being shot in 2000 when another Bush election was going on, which is incredibly interesting. He called it where the two paths basically just aligned in that kind of like overlap wormhole sort of way, connective tissue between two timelines. He had an obsession with the apocalypse, with the end of the world. He thought that the movie would be cathartic and a sort of divine quest for finding an entity or confronting God. I wouldn't say that this movie is religious exactly so much as spiritual, which Kelly himself said it's a spiritual film. The religious notes in it were kind of accidental as he talks about their budget. He said his costume designer was the one who said that she was running low on funds to make everybody look like they were in the 80s. And she said, if you just made this a private Catholic school, everybody could be in uniforms and then we could spend the money on the Halloween outfits. And that's what they did. And funny enough is that the film is very popular with Catholics, and they like the setting and the cross and the IHS and the religious imagery, but that was not intentional at all. It just was one of those things. Surely this cannot just be one of those things. A lot of parallels to Magnolia, too, particularly for me, this rewatch with the Mad World sequence reminded me so much of Wise Up and how they are either preceded by or follow an act of God, quote unquote act of God, as his teacher tells him, that sounds like an act of God. So there is this sense of timing being very important in terms of its release. Came out very close to Mulholland Drive, artificial intelligence. It was 6 weeks post 9/11 and was a flop. Nobody wanted to see something like this. And if I think about these sort of parallels in terms of if you think of the trajectory of the alcoholic and the alcoholic who gets sober, at least, there is this sense of impending doom. If you are near rock bottom, whatever that is, depends on the person, right? But this sense of impending doom. So when Donnie is sleepwalking, I could sense this very strange duality where both are true no matter which state you're in. Like being high or being drunk or being on some sort of mood altering substance does make you feel like you're sleepwalking through life, that you are in a unreality and incapable of responding to things moment to moment as they are. So that representation makes sense in that context. Like you're drugged, you're unaware, you are in fantasy land. But then also, once you wake up and you're no longer aided by that, And you have this sense of a higher power or something guiding, like in Darko, that liquid that's coming out of them, that not exactly a spirit in this sense, because it's definitely solid depiction and that Kelly chose to do. But that feeling of there being a rhythm to things, getting in the groove of things, being directed by something, is closer to reality. So it's so interesting to me that sleepwalkingness, or that sort of removal from being in the exclusive present, could be applied to both states. I don't know that Kelly meant to do that, but I definitely relate to both in opposite ways, which is not a sensation or a feeling I normally get from a movie. And I think that's one of the geniuses of this film. My buddy Miles wrote about this in his review, The Unreality versus Reality, and how we can go in and out of it fairly seamlessly. He wrote, Kelly understands that we can hypnotize ourselves, wandering curiously into the far reaches of our inner minds, but that hypnosis can be easily destroyed simply when someone walks into our room. The line between reality and unreality is paper thin. But when you are using, that isn't paper thin. It is hard. It is a big divide. And I think it's impossible to see that when you're in it, but then everyone who is around you notices it pretty loud and clear. But it's really, really hard in that sort of state to recognize how unreal everything is. In your response? Another thing I think is interesting is the differences between the theatrical cut and the director's cut. For the director's cut, the thing that stood out to me most was that Kelly said he had an extended therapy sequence where Dr. Thurman, played by Catherine Ross, explains to Donnie the difference between an atheist and an agnostic. And for some reason, this differentiation was important to him to note, that an agnostic has an open door to the possibility of a master designer. And I like that idea, an open door to the possibility. And perhaps that's why it's called a spiritual film, is because Kelly, even though he wasn't necessarily advocating belief of any kind, because the character that believes in God in this movie is pretty awful. And then the one Swayze character who appears, Jen Cunningham, to know all the answers, is a total fraud and an awful person. Messed up. And so I don't think he's trying to say or offer any sort of solution, but there's so much accuracy here that recognizes, in a similar way I think that Memoria perhaps does, that it isn't just us here, maybe. Not even definitely, but just maybe. Like, are we willing to ponder that? And in the sci-fi setting, it's more natural for characters to ask questions about things that don't exist, like time machines and time travel and wormholes. And how can we go back and thinking that there's some credence to this because he sees a magical bunny. Frank, who is what makes me think about the ring conversation or the ring point that Frank has him commit bad actions, and that in the context of this film, violence is justified because it either leads to something good or saves someone or burns down a house that needed to be burned down. But I'm not entirely convinced that Frank is meant to be Donnie's saving grace. I think perhaps if there is one in the film, then it's the therapist. Which this is another interesting thing. Kelly said that he was a lot more drawn to this as a sci-fi superhero movie rather than it being about mental illness or teenage suicide, because he said that the pills that Dr. Thurman prescribes are placebos. He actually said they're water pills, which is, I don't know if that's in the director's cut, but it's definitely not theatrical that that's given, that she basically deceives his parents and him and tells them that he's on medication for paranoid schizophrenia, and he's not at all. They're literally water pills. And two things going on there. One is that Kelly said that she felt that something supernatural or otherworldly was happening to Donnie and didn't want to impact that phenomena directly, but just have him thinking that it's doing something actually changed his attitude towards what he saw. And then that Kelly himself was saying that at that time that he wrote this, that people were drugging kids, I guess, versus having behavioral therapy. And he wanted to emphasize the value in not just pumping him with meds. So that whole angle to me is an interesting one if I think about it in the context of addiction, because oftentimes I think that if we feel like something is happening, like, well, when I drink, I'm more confident, I'm more talkative, I think I'm more attractive, I'm more fun to be around. Is it possible that part of, perhaps not the whole, but part of that feeling is because we believe that it does that? Or you could replace it with anything really that is a stimulant or even a depressive if it relaxes you. But I know there's a chemical component there, but I think we have more mental power than we realize. And that's an interesting point. Frank shows up in the film after Donnie's taken the pills, and if you know while you're watching it that that the director and writer specifically made it so that those pills don't do anything, then that means that Frank is showing up because Donnie believes that they're doing something. So he's completely in control. They aren't daylight hallucinations. He can summon him, basically. Or maybe it's that maybe it's that belief puts us into a certain automatic posture where we're more receptive to weird things happening or unusual things occurring than we would be otherwise. Like, oh, I have permission to act this way because I took this. I wonder if we could ever get to a place where we could just give ourselves permission to act in whatever way that we think is best without having to give a reason why. In a Rolling Stone article in 2021 titled, "What the Hell is Donnie Darko About Anyway?" in honor of its 20th anniversary, Richard Kelly said, quote, "I look at the events in the film as a sort of divine and supernatural intervention, where a select group of characters happen to be living in the proximity of this science fiction event." His thesis statement for the film, just pure concept. I really like the phrasing here. If Donnie gets out of bed, why? What is this voice that draws the teenage boy out of bed to dodge a bullet from the heavens? What's the journey he goes along? If we hear that voice or hear a voice or a prompting or feel led to do something, do we question where it comes from so much as if we have the power to do it? Last year, one of the first meetings I went to, this lady was talking about that she was raised in the church and she had really bad experiences. They were very negative experiences, and she didn't want to have anything to do with God. She didn't want to have anything to do with Christian people. But she said that she wanted to pray, and she didn't know how to pray. And for some reason, I didn't know this person at all, and I haven't seen her since. But after the meeting, I went up to her and I said, you know, that little voice inside your head that feels like your conscience? And she said, yes, I do. And I said, pray to that. I think we just majorly complicate things. And yet, if we're given the context of horror or science fiction or fantasy adventure, it's like the genre itself releases us from that judgmental constraint that we would normally have. Not even just on characters, but just on ourselves. Like, now I can be silly, or I can consider these ideas that in another context I would think were a waste of time. And I think that's what sobriety is sort of all about, is stripping away the need to do that so that you can just tell the truth all the time and not be afraid of mystery and not feel foolish, being interested in what you can't explain, and being okay that you don't understand everything. Jason Schwartzman was originally the one that was going to be Donnie Darko. He was fresh off Rushmore, and Kelly said that he really believed in the project and it wouldn't have been made without him. But he had scheduling conflicts, so went to Jake, who Kelly met by accident in Drew Barrymore's office. The DP he used, Stephen Poster, was the second unit for Close Encounters. So there is this definite alien look to everything, I think. Especially once it gets into the second half of the film. We've also got a bunch of old school cinephile stuff there where you can tell that Kelly loves movies and definitely had a blockbuster card. There's the Back to the Future nods, particularly when Donnie says to his dad, "We almost hit her with the car," when he's talking about Roberta Sparrow. And then when he's talking to the teacher, he says, "Oh, Back to the Future, I love how that movie's shot," which sounds just like something we'd say. And then Kelly said he was heavily influenced by Peggy Sue Got Married, Coppola's time travel movie, that the sparkle motion outfits were modeled after the silver fabric from Kathleen Turner's prom dress. It debuted at Sundance when he was 25 years old, just out of college. Kind of another parallel to me with Paul Thomas Anderson's Magnolia. Just where these guys just wrote. Kelly said that it just flowed out of him. It came out in a rush. And it was like a stream of consciousness unraveling. There's also obviously parallels between the two. Donnie wants to be a writer or a painter, he says. He wants to change things. He has emotional problems. The philosophy of time travel is an interesting addition. For me, the parallel there when I was watching today was The Big Book. How Donnie says, I'm seeing stuff, like a lot of really messed up stuff, and there's chapters in that book that describe the stuff I've been seeing. It can't just be a coincidence. That's such a common sensation of like early days working the steps. I was reading as much as I could just by whomever. I even read the recovery book by Russell Brand and Breathing Underwater by Richard Rohr. And it was uncanny to read about my experience in those pages. It's very humbling. I don't think I had a sense of humility before I got sober. In fact, I know I didn't. And I think that's a little bit what happened with Donnie. Through his trajectory, he learns that actions have consequences, that one thing impacts another, which impacts another. And I think that lesson is fully learned by the end in his decision. And that's really what growing up is. It's taking responsibility and realizing that you impact other people, and perhaps that there's no such thing as coincidences. I also like when he labels it as traveling within God's channel, even though that's not fully fleshed out there. He makes it sound sort of Minority Report lingo, where it's like, no, if you're in God's channel, it doesn't mean that you can't choose. It's that whatever you would choose would be right, and it would fall in line there. Like, you would never negate that channel if you're in it, basically. You would never choose to negate it, which is an interesting idea. And it's not the science of time travel, it's the philosophy. Edith wrote in her review, it's about what is and why, not A plus B equals C, like a math equation. He returns to the wreckage and realizes he was spared. It's also about tapping into a higher knowledge of how the world works. Like entering a portal. That's definitely what it's like to get sober. I almost wish that everyone could get sober from whatever it is that they are most wanting to stop and can't, just for 3 months, let's say. And then they could go back to it if they want, but I find myself constantly thinking, I wish everyone knew these feelings. Not in the sense that I think that I'm privileged or better, although I do feel privileged, but more just so that it makes life almost like a movie in a way. Like you're in like a Stephen King story where you're able to see the world, your own world, not the world, your world, in a different way. And it's like awakening to it. People describe like going to rehab and coming out and looking outside and being able to see flowers and being able to feel the sun, because there's such a dulling of the senses. And you think that when you're drinking, there's a heightening of these things, but it really is a dulling comparatively. I just find myself getting more and more passionate about sharing, I suppose. Entering reality after being removed from it a while feels like entering a portal. Speaking of Stephen King, at the beginning, she's reading Stephen King's It. The kids are on bikes. The whole Smurf conversation reminds me of something that King would write. I wonder if that was just a nod to that. The bunny, Frank, sort of being reminiscent of Harvey, actually, is what I thought this time. Jimmy Stewart film. And Donnie is a little bit similar to Stewart's character there, where he's a little bit, he's able to have a sense of humor about things and sort of go with the flow and not think it's weird that he's walking around talking to a rabbit. I love what my buddy Andy Swart wrote, that in his review, when they're in the theater and Donnie's talking to Frank and he's saying, "Why are you wearing that stupid bunny suit?" And Frank says, "Why are you wearing that stupid man suit?" And Swart wrote, "Hey, ask them that. Why are you wearing that stupid man suit while Scorsese's Last Temptation of Christ lurks on the marquee?" Which is so spot on. Like, what a great observation. Just like Christ putting on the man suit. That was accidental also, by the way. He said that wasn't, Kelly said that was another thing the Catholics just sort of went all over, was the fact that Last Temptation and Evil Dead were double feature there at the theater. And he was like, it was just because it was in 1988. But it's so interesting how we attribute meaning to things. And who's to say, you know, maybe there was a subliminal thing there and it was meant to be, and it was even beyond what Kelly was planning. But I always think that's so interesting when you could feel so much for a film and it could mean so much to you, and then you find out that the person who created it meant something totally different. What does that mean? That's something that happens in the movie Juliet Naked based on Nick Hornby, where Ethan Hawke's the artist and he's like, yeah, this album I did, it's silly, it's dumb, I don't like it. And his biggest fan is like, I loved it and it meant something to me. And that's what matters at the end of the day, right? What matters is what we take away and what it means to us. I'm going to read you guys. I was thinking what the final thing I wanted to share was, out of all the things I've read in these 365 days, and all the films I've watched, and all the Amy's Progress conversations, and the podcast, and the crying, and the therapy, and the steps. And if I had to share one thing that I have not mastered but find invaluable, this is it. This is from a book that I read called Loving What Is by Byron Katie. I'm going to read you the end of this chapter, and it's called Staying in Your Own Business. I can find only 3 kinds of business in the universe: mine, yours, and God's. For me, the word God means reality. Reality is God because it rules. Anything that's out of my control, your control, and everyone else's control, I call that God's business. Much of our stress comes from mentally living out of our own business. When I think, you need to get a job, I want you to be happy, you should be on time, you need to take better care of yourself, I'm in your business. When I'm worried about earthquakes, floods, war, or when I will die, I'm in God's business. If I am mentally in your business or in God's business, the effect is separation. I noticed this early in 1986 when I mentally went into my mother's business, for example, with a thought like, my mother should understand me. I immediately experienced a feeling of loneliness. And I realized that every time in my life that I had felt hurt or lonely, I had been in someone else's business. If you are living your life and I am mentally living your life, who is here living mine? We're both over there. Being mentally in your business keeps me from being present in my own. I am separate from myself, wondering why my life isn't working. To think that I know what's best for anyone else is to be out of my business. Even in the name of love, it is pure arrogance. And the result is tension, anxiety, and fear. Do I even know what's right for me? That is my only business. Let me work with that before I try to solve your problems for you. if you practice it for a while, you may come to see that you don't have any business either, and that your life runs perfectly well on its own. I like how at the very end of the film, after Donnie dies laughing, just as the movie started with him smiling, Jenna comes riding on her bike and she says, "Oh, what happened here?" And the boy says, "Oh, this jet engine went through this kid's window and he died." And he's like, "Did you know him?" And she says, "No, what's his name?" "Donnie Darko." It immediately reminded me of when Marty is leaving the Enchantment Under the Sea dance and he's saying goodbye to Lorraine and George. And she says, "Marty, such a nice name." I feel like Donnie Darko is a lot of things to many people, and they make charts and spend all of this thought, and they will go to his website and read about time travel. But at the end of the day, he's just a kid who loved Back to the Future and wants to see a kid go back in time and save people he loves. Pretty simple, right? Donnie, such a nice name.